Welcome to Emotion Well, EFR's podcast about all things related to emotional well-being. I'm Johanna Dunleavy, the EAP Operations Director for Employee and Family Resources, also known as EFR, and I'm the host of our podcast. As an FYI, EFR is located in Des Moines, Iowa, and we are Iowa's first employee assistance program and provide a variety of services you can learn more about at www.efr.org. Welcome, Hayl Bergeland, to Emotion Well. Hayl, thank you so much for being here today.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. I'm looking forward to discussing with you.
Yes, so Hayl is one of my colleagues at Employee and Family Resources. She is our suicide prevention grant coordinator. And so we are going to be talking about suicide, and that is a sensitive topic and could potentially, just be triggering for some individuals. So I just want to give our listeners a heads up that that is what our conversation is about today. Hayl is a subject matter expert when it comes to this topic. And so I've extended an invitation for her to be on the podcast. As many people know, and many people maybe don't know, September is Suicide Awareness and Prevention Month. And so I thought that this would be a great opportunity to have Hayl come on the podcast and talk to us about the work she does, not only at Employee and Family Resources, but just about suicide in general. So very excited to have you on. And I think this is such an important topic for us to cover. So before we get into the topic, I would love to learn a little bit more about you, Hayl, and share kind of at your own comfort level with our listeners, a little bit about your background and how you came to EFR.
Yeah, sure. So I've kind of had a myriad of experiences that I think that probably led me into this role. My bachelor's degree is in psychology and applied behavior analysis. And when I was getting my bachelor's degree, I really kind of developed an interest in more, I would say crisis response for sure. Working with individuals that were experiencing a crisis. And then at the time I worked for a nonprofit. I founded and developed a nonprofit. And one of the services I was providing through that nonprofit was animal assisted crisis response.
Okay.
And so I had some contracts where a canine of mine, so a dog that I had trained to do crisis response, and I would get called or would respond to crises or disasters that were across the state of Iowa. And so that kind of led me down this path to begin with. I also worked in hospice. And so I was a hospice social worker, did bereavement coordination. And so definitely having conversations with individuals and families that were, in their most vulnerable parts of their life and dealing with not only death, but a lot of times the trauma and often, again, crisis situations that can arise was, again, part of my work. And then I decided to go get my master's degree, and in my master's education, I focused on gerontology. That's what my master's in, but I also got a couple of graduate certificates, and one of them was in grief support. And I think, again, because of my experience with the nonprofit that I had worked in, and then also working in hospice, it seemed pretty obvious that I wanted to expand on that education. But I also did a graduate certificate in conflict resolution, and one of the kind of focuses of that coursework was really driven by trauma and response to traumatic loss, and then also violent death. And so that kind of started on this path. I ended up working with a couple different agencies in Polk County, worked with individuals that had been impacted by suicidal loss, but as well as other forms of violent death. And kind of continue to be on this path. I still do crisis response every once in a while. If we get a call, my dog and I do, we will still go and respond to crisis and disasters. And so I think this was an opportunity that I kind of found, honestly, at random at a time when I was looking for a new opportunity, and it seemed to fit really perfect. And I'm really glad that I'm here.
Yeah.
So.
And is Ferdy your dog, the dog that I met?
Yes.
Okay. Well, he's a great dog. So
Yeah.
I can imagine how he brings comfort to a lot of people going through crises.
Yep. So he's kind of on a little bit of retirement, but every once in a while, if we get response calls, he's still my most experienced canine, and yeah, so he still does that work when we're needed.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, very cool. Well, thank you for sharing so much. I didn't know all of those different facets of your life and what you
Yeah.
did prior to coming to EFR. So, we did a podcast 4 years ago with my friend Destiny, and she lost her brother to suicide. It's been probably 16 years ago now, but I remember when I had reached out to her to be on the podcast, there was just like a part of me that was really nervous to ask her if she would be willing to
Yeah.
just share about her brother's life and kind of the experience that she and her siblings and parents went through after he passed away. And I thought a lot about how, because he died by suicide, it made it harder for me to ask her for whatever
Sure.
reason. You know, if
Yeah.
it would have been a different type of ending to his life, I might have been less hesitant. And so I'm just curious. First of all, can you kind of just shed light on why people can be maybe reluctant to talk about this topic? And, um, is it normal to feel a little bit nervous to bring it up? If you know someone who has lost a loved one by suicide, or even if, and I know we'll talk about suicide prevention a lot today, but even asking those hard questions if you think someone is suicidal. So, why do you
Yeah.
think this is such a sensitive topic for people to think about and talk about?
Yeah, so I think it's a multifaceted issue. I think, and I could say too, definitely from working in hospice, we are definitely, as a culture, as a society, a very avoidant
Mhm.
society. The death just in general makes us uncomfortable. Talking about death and dying, makes us uncomfortable. Um, and then, I think the thing that kind of, again, kind of related to that, but a little bit of an entirely separate issue that is still something that I think that this work is constantly trying to address is the stigma associated with suicide.
Mhm.
You know, um, there's a lot of history of stigma surrounding suicide. I think that it's gotten better. The more understanding and the more we talk about it, that seems to, I think, that it seems to be alleviated a little bit in certain conversations, definitely in groups where people feel safe. But as a society, again, we tend to really focus on suicide from kind of more of a sensationalist perspective. There's a lot of issues on reporting of suicide and not just the stigma, but the misconceptions, the misunderstandings that people have. So I think that speaks to a lot of it. I think too, because it is so incredibly sensitive and very traumatic,
Mhm.
especially for the individuals that have lost somebody to suicide. That it's just a topic that's uncomfortable to
Yeah.
approach. I think that even in the conversations I've had with people over the years and even now, it's something I'm used to. I'm pretty comfortable, but it doesn't mean that I, don't understand that, especially depending on the context or the situation, um, you know, that it still makes people uncomfortable, that
Yeah.
it can still be incredibly sensitive. Yeah, and so I think that there's just a lot to it where of any kind of violent death, I think stirs a lot of, again, misunderstandings, but strong feelings.
Sure.
Um, Suicide loss, I think, is unique in that a lot of times family members, friends, people in the social circle feel a lot of guilt and a
Yeah.
lot of shame. Again, I think that's part of the stigma, the societal, cultural expectations that we put on people, and so I think that contributes to that. But I think that also it's a really difficult conversation to approach because you really are talking about something that is so incredibly vulnerable for the person in so many different ways. I think the last bit of that too is that we are a society where if we think that there's a problem, a concern, something that upsets us, we really want to fix it.
Yeah.
And this definitely comes up with any time that we lose somebody, that there's a death close to us. We want to have a solution. We want to be able to say, here's something that will make you feel better. Here's something that will kind of address this. And suicide is one of those where there aren't any perfect answers. Not that there are with any death, but And there aren't really a lot of solutions that seem obvious, and families and individuals, friends don't really know how to respond just
Yeah.
in general. What do you do about it? So yeah, I think in a long way, I feel like that was a long
No, I think
response.
but I think
Yeah,
you covered, like you said, it's a multifaceted, right? There's not an easy answer to that question, and of course, it's going to vary from person to person and culture to
yeah,
culture, and
right.
but I think a lot of people's lives have been impacted by suicide, whether it's someone that they were directly connected to or indirectly connected to. So I think it's important that we're talking about this because I think that helps break the stigma and hopefully makes people more comfortable, if they need to talk about it or if they need to reach out and ask for help, because that's the other side of this conversation is that there are some people who are in a position where they may be contemplating or having that suicidal ideation, and we certainly want to be able to talk with those people as well. So without going into like too many statistics and details around statistics, I would be curious to hear what you share with people when you're educating around suicide prevention and self harm. What are some of the things that you think people should know about suicide?
Yeah. Well, I can, kind of, I get at this from a couple different perspectives. One of the reasons that Employee Family Resources has this grant that is the reason my job is here, is because of the data and the increase in suicide risk that we've seen in the state of Iowa, really over the last several years. So, suicide across all age populations is the ninth leading cause of death. And when you think of that, it doesn't, in comparison to, for instance, for cancer, you think that the ninth leading cause of
Hmm.
death is not maybe that big of a concern since there's 8 other causes of death that are above that.
Right.
However, the issue that we've seen in Iowa is that the majority of violent deaths in Iowa, so anywhere, depending on the county, anywhere from 81% all the way up to almost 84%, are suicide deaths. The other
Gotcha.
thing is, yeah, the other thing is, statistically speaking, based on our population, so for suicide deaths based on death certificates where it is for sure the death has been confirmed to be a suicide. Typically we see in the state of Iowa that out of every 100,000 people that have died, 18 to 20 of those are suicide deaths. Something important to note with that,
Okay.
though, is that it can be really difficult to ascertain whether or not a death is absolutely for sure a death by suicide. So we know those numbers are always going to be higher than possibly what the data shows us. Based on Iowa's population, we are quite a bit higher with regards to those deaths per 100,000 than the national average. So, and that has
Okay.
been, we've been steadily increasing. So we've been getting higher and higher compared to the national average for the last several years. So that's one of the reasons why this grant is here. The data
Yeah.
shows us too that we're seeing the risk, so suicide risk and attempts increase, certainly amongst youth, so individuals from age 10 to about 24 years old. And so this grant that I manage coordinate is specific to youth. So it is a youth suicide prevention grant. That being said, the majority of suicide deaths, so confirmed deaths by suicide, tend to be in men, and specifically in men that are older, so the older population. The highest risk or the highest number of deaths tend to be men over the age of 65. As age increases, those deaths tend to be higher as well. But in the state of Iowa, we're consistently seeing, again, a significant proportion of those deaths are men aged about 40 to 55, 60. Um,
Okay.
yeah. So, you know,
So what about you? It's the ninth leading cause of death,
Mm-hmm.
but if you break it into those different age groups, then it
Hmm.
becomes much higher on that list, right? So like what is it
Right.
for the, did you say 10 to 24 years old? I mean, would it be one of the top causes of death in that
Yeah,
age group?
it tends to be at the number two, number three, again, depending on, if you really narrow those age range, that'll change a little bit. But yeah,
Sure.
typically we're seeing, again, youth. So if we categorize youth as age 10 to 24, as this grant does, then we're seeing it at the second leading cause of death or third leading cause of death. So
Okay.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So
And I have a random question, and you may not know the answer, but earlier you said, it's sometimes hard to ascertain whether or not someone's death was suicide.
right.
How do they put parameters around determining if it's, do you know how a death is
Yeah.
determined a suicide if there is question?
Yeah, I think that it really comes down to the death investigation and who's responsible for doing that. I think too, it also comes
Okay,
down to the family, caregivers, guardians, family
gotcha.
members of the individual,
Hmm.
and whether or not they want that information shared. But that's really
Okay.
the extent of my knowledge on it too. I think the other thing is who's collecting that data, how are we recording that data, and who's actually responsible for collecting the data would be the other piece of that puzzle for sure. So yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
yeah,
thanks for answering that. It's
yeah,
just a question I had as you mentioned that.
sure.
So I would like you to share a little bit more about your role at EFR and
Yeah.
like tell our listeners what are the types of things that you're doing in this role, the places you might be going, the audiences that you are speaking with. Just tell us more about your role and how you're helping inform and educate people about this topic.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so as I mentioned, EFR has a grant awarded from Iowa HHS. Iowa HHS received grant from SAMHSA, so it's the Garrett Lee Smith grant that provided funds for this work. So the grant is a community-based youth suicide prevention grant, which to simplify, the work is really focused on a few different things. Really, three really things are what I'm focusing on. Is so it's identifying risk or how we would determine risk in the youth population. So all of those, social determinants, social drivers of health, as well as the biopsychosocial factors of an individual. Um, and then if we're identifying risk, what are we doing about it, right? And so for us, for this grant, a big piece of that is teaching individuals, so especially individuals that work with youth or a youth serving organization, to screen for risk. And then once that screening has happened, what's the next step do you do? And so then the other big piece of that puzzle is teaching organizations, individuals, how to support an individual that may be at risk, that may have expressed suicidal ideation, maybe are even engaging in suicidal behaviors. And then how do you connect them to resources or refer them to relevant sources of support? And so that's a big component of
Sure.
this grant. The other big piece of this grant is focusing then on those trainings. So what can we do on the community level to uplift the community so that
Hmm.
community-based orgs, nonprofits, primary care physicians, hospitals, schools for sure feel more prepared to identify risk, but then also again provide those sources of support to have conversations about suicide. And then if we're having those conversations about suicide, what do those conversations look like? And what are we doing again to support that individual? How do we connect them to sources of support that they need, that are relevant to their individual needs? And then how do we ensure follow up? So if all those things have
Yeah.
happened, right, we want to make sure then that we're not just having those conversations and then leaving that person to deal with this issue on their own, that we're going back and connecting the dots and making sure that they have continual access to sources of support.
Can you share what some of those resources are that you may be connecting individuals with?
Yeah. So, well, I can, and I'll start with a couple things too. So the once we've trained entities or individuals to be able to identify risk and then connect people to sources of support, we're really trying to get the community as a whole. So this grant is really focused on Polk County, but this is something that we're looking at across the state to get people to understand that there are resources like 988. So 988 is the crisis
Right.
lifeline. You can call or text or chat. And it's not just for individuals too. That's another big piece of this preventative puzzle is to understand that you can connect with 988 before you've, have gotten to that point where you really are experiencing, suicidal ideation or behaviors. You can
Sure.
chat with 988 really at any time. Anything that's going on in your life, they are a source of support. In addition to 988 too, then we really want individuals to connect with community-based resources. So for instance, EFR has an employee assistance program. We also have a student assistance program. I think community-based resources like that, where individuals can connect through their school or through their organization with counselors and continual
Hmm.
social support are critical. Again, too, it's a critical preventative measure, not waiting to talk to a counselor or a licensed mental health therapist, but thinking of it as just a checkup. We all need preventative care, and I think those types of community-based resources are critical. And then the other, piece of it too is understanding that there's national resources. So, in addition to 988, there is like the Suicide Prevention Resource Center, which provides trainings and education, and oftentimes there's free. There's the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, which we have a local chapter in
Hmm.
Iowa that does a lot at the community level, in addition to suicide awareness walks and prevention efforts. There's trainings that you can do for free. There's suicide loss support groups. There's research that you can access. So just making people aware of what's out there, and instead of, what we tend to see happen is we tend to be really reactive. We, wait for a crisis
Sure.
situation, and then we're really grasping at where we should go. Oftentimes that means that we're going to the ER or we're calling 911.
Yeah.
And those are
Yep.
resources for sure, but we really want to make people aware that there's also alternatives, and there's community-based supports available. So yeah.
What about, because so much of your work is focused on youth,
Mhm.
if a parent or a guardian, aunt, uncle, neighbor suspect that, someone in their life is struggling and maybe suicidal, what would be some, helpful suggestions? What might you say to that person, whether they're, a youth or not? But just I'm,
Yeah.
thinking, especially as it relates to the work you're doing for EFR, youth focused. What do we want to say to people that we think are struggling or who have openly admitted that they're struggling?
Yeah, I think that first and foremost is just being open to a conversation. Letting that
Okay.
person, yeah, letting that person share their story, and letting them share the story in a way that it's not about you. Again, your role is to not fix the situation. Research has shown time and time again that enabling an individual to share their story, what's going on, truly, describe how they're thinking and feeling, and whether or not they know, but just being able to talk about it is incredibly helpful. That's the thing. Having a safe space to talk about what you're experiencing is the critical source of support. We tend to, again, because of just how we're raised or how we're taught or whatever our preconceived notions are about mental health, we tend to really focus again on a solution, or, trying to tell the person, you have so many other things going on, or again, that really trying to fix it attitude instead of giving the person
Yeah.
space to just feel what they
Yeah.
feel. And so that's, some of the training that we do is really just kind of, I'm really honestly trying to get people to understand that just creating a safe space, just being there sometimes is enough. You don't have to have solutions. Just be a person, a non-judgmental person in a safe space for that individual to share their story. Yeah, so I think that's,
Yeah.
probably the most of all things, the most critical thing. Again, if you are a parent, an individual, a friend, you can absolutely as well yourself call, chat, text 988 and ask for resources. But there, in the state of Iowa, for instance, we also now have or will have through Iowa Primary Care Association system navigators that an individual can call and help get connected to resources. Again, looking at those community-based resources, if you are an individual that, let's say that you already receive counseling services through an employment assistance program, but it's your son or your daughter or your friend that needs help, that individual that you're receiving services from is a source of support. So I think again, just connect in safe spaces and be a person that is open to
Yeah.
having those conversations is really kind of the beginning path to all of it, honestly. So yeah.
What do you hope to see in the coming years as it relates to suicide prevention support and awareness? What are your hopes if you could say in 5 years this is what I'll be talking about?
That's a big question. I think that, I,
It
as somebody,
is.
as somebody that's worked with grants for a long time, I always hope that there's, reoccurring sources of funding for grants to support continued work like this.
Yeah.
It comes down to a lot of times the financial viability of the work. But I think also too is that it really comes down to the more that we're having these conversations and offering opportunities to get trained, in risk screening or just having an understanding of the warning signs of suicide in different populations. I hope to see then that the stigma starts to be addressed and reduced. And if we can address the stigma,
Mhm.
people are more likely to talk about it. And if people are more likely to talk about it and find sources of support, then we'll see risk and then decrease. And then by way of risk decreasing, we hope to see less suicide deaths. But, I think that I'm hoping through grant work like this that we create community avenues for more discussion. We as a community come together for, as corny as maybe that sounds, but to work together on strategic efforts that actually look at addressing or at least trying to come up with some solutions for why there's risk in the first place. What is it about an individual's social drivers of health that puts them at an increased risk for suicide? What can we do about those things? And so for me, that looks at addressing all those social drivers themselves. So housing, access to food, access
Yeah.
to shelter, access to education, inclusive healthcare. Those are all the huge pieces of this, the again pieces of puzzle that are what make up risk. And so if we really want to address this as a public health issue, which this grant is a public health focused grant, then we have to look at the public health facets of risk. So yeah, I don't know if it's not a very clear, concise answer, but I
No.
think because the solutions are not always so clear cut, there's a lot of work to be done.
Yeah. Well, and I think like you said, yeah, and like the sustainability of the community resources and support and funding to keep this conversation going and keep people like you in the community providing these types of programs, I think is so
Yes,
important. So
exactly.
what like resources do you have for our listeners? Maybe it's a book, a website. I know we've mentioned 988 several times, and I think that's a
Yep.
great resource to reiterate, and we'll include that in the show notes. But what about, there are people that write books and have podcasts, and are there any resources that you would say, hey, if this is a topic you want to learn more about, I would recommend checking this out?
Yeah, for sure. Well, our own EFR's website has on our community-based services page, we have resources on there. We have Iowa-based resources as well as national resources. Um, so, some of those include, for instance, on a national level, there's the Suicide Prevention Resource Center which like I mentioned earlier is a website where you can access trainings for free, webinars, handouts, sources of research, all those kinds of things. And so that is a great continual resource and source of support. The American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, I think, is a great national resource, but again, we also have our local chapter. So their website, again, offers a ton of information. But through AFSP, you can, as a community or as an individual, take trainings. So you can take a training, for instance, it's called Talk Saves Lives, which is something that I offer, which is an introduction to suicide prevention, covers warning signs, risk and protective factors, a little bit of data and statistics, but then as well as covers how do you approach the subject with an individual that may be at risk. There's a lot of trainings actually through AFSP Iowa. Another one that EFR offers, and I'm a certified trainer, is ASSIST, so Applied Suicide Intervention Skills Training. It is one of the only really evidence-based suicide prevention. It's actually prevention and intervention training. It is considered suicide first aid. It is an intensive, I'm not going to lie on here, is it an intensive workshop? But it is, I think, an exemplary workshop if you really want to learn how to not only, again, have these conversations, but to practice it. So practice it in a group of individuals that also want to do the same kind of work, regardless of whatever your work is, whether you are a licensed mental health counselor or you're just a community member and you want to do more. ASSIST teaches you how to have conversations with an individual experiencing suicidal thoughts and how do you get them connected to sources of support. We also, EFR, myself and Haley Peterson Hunley, can offer CALM, so Counseling on Access to Lethal Means, which addresses, the big elephant in the room is having conversations with individuals and families about access to lethal means in your home. So whether that's firearms, medications, that type of stuff, and how do you approach that subject to make sure that you can keep that individual safe? I think those are some of the main ones.
We added Assist and Calm to our training catalog of offerings, so we'll also link to those in the show notes. So if someone is listening and they want to bring either of those trainings to their workplace or community, they can certainly learn more about those online through our website as well.
Yep, exactly. So, and I think too, again, one of the things that I really advocate for is at the community level, getting involved with what's happening at your county, but within the community locations that you're already actively involved in. So whether that might be your church or a club, or even a sports, if, whatever is a space that you are around individuals that you feel safe with and comfortable with, and having these conversations. Again, I think a lot of times we leave the conversation or prevention of suicide to clinical professionals. But the data and the research shows us that the most effective approach is a public health approach coming from the community. So coming from individuals within their community, talking to individuals in their community, and again, being that safe person. And so, I'm always going to say, regardless of what training you decide that's perfect for you, just having one, even if you're in a space that would be considered more untraditional, it goes a long way for prevention. I think, like I said, if we can do more in the way of a community approach, like I said, the most effective form of prevention, I think, comes from the community. So, yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. And we have so much information to drop in the show notes so people can kind of follow up on these different resources you mentioned, including we do have a great webpage on our website dedicated to the work you do and other resources, both local and nationally. So thank you so much, Hayl. This is such an important topic. Appreciate the work you do, not just for EFR, but in the community in general. And, we need people like you to help get this information out. And it's, probably not an easy job. Not everyone would be cut out to do this work. And so I really appreciate that you have this passion and commitment to EFR and to preventing suicide and raising awareness around it. So thank you so much.
Yes,
And
thank
again,
you.
everything will be in the show notes for our listeners to follow up with.
Thanks so much.
Thank you for listening to Emotion Well. Employee and Family Resources is a 501c3 nonprofit organization located in Des Moines, Iowa. We support communities, workplaces, and schools with comprehensive behavioral health services. If you would like to contribute to our mission, please click on the donation link in our show notes.